When it comes to classic arcade games, I find there's three types of them. Firstly, there's the ones that lived and died in the arcade. They were what they were, just the arcade game. Maybe not a lot of sequels, didn't really take off into a big series or anything after that. And then we have the ones that did take off. These ones naturally evolved into franchises on home consoles. They were able to take that simple gameplay and mold it into something much longer, much bigger, something that makes sense to have at home rather than the arcade. And then there's the awkward guys, the ones that featured gameplay that didn't really easily translate into a longer experience. So when they tried doing just that, they had to either keep the gameplay really primitive or they had to reinvent it entirely. A pretty good example of this would be Space Invaders. Space Invaders is so simple that it doesn't really work as a longer, full retail game anymore. The closest they got to that would probably be the 1999 version for N64 and PlayStation. It was complete with awesome power-ups and some pretty dope boss fights. Seriously, this game's underrated as hell, but that's where it peaked. Any Space Invaders onward is something that resembles a simpler, more arcade-like gameplay, something you'd find downloadable for $5 or $10. Pac-Man, on the other hand, took a much different route. They experimented a lot with this guy back then. The Pac-Man World series ditched the mazes entirely and made a 3D platformer out of them, creating a moveset that made sense for the character while working in elements of the classic arcade games. Other Pac-Man games stayed closer to the maze formula, and there were some pretty good action games in that style too. Both styles ended up working really well for Pac-Man. They made some pretty dang good games. But after that experimental period of the late 90s and early 2000s, just like Space Invaders, they just kind of went back to making those smaller arcade-like experiences for $5 or $10. And that always kind of baffled me, you know? Like, it seems like there was a time where they finally figured out how you can make non-arcade updated versions of some of these classic arcade characters. Some of which, like Pac-Man World, both were received and sold really, really well. Yet despite that, they always seem to fall off the track and just go back to making arcade-like games instead. And like, I get it, with digital distribution becoming widely accessible with the release of consoles like the 360, it was now possible to create smaller and cheaper games for download, which was a perfect fit for those simpler arcade games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Frogger. And there's another big series that's done this, Frogger. Back in '81, Konami was dominating arcades with this thing. The simple yet challenging gameplay had a lot of arcade goers hooked, and it munched quarters like Pac-Man munched power pellets. And quarters, like Pac-Man also munched quarters. And like Pac-Man, Frogger also had a time where they tried to turn him into a more ambitious series, before randomly going back to just doing arcade-like titles in the later 2000s. There are so many of these Frogger games, like, I think we sometimes forget just how many they put out. Between 97 and 2005, they released 11 Frogger games, and by just looking at them, they go through multiple different art styles, several different developers, multiple types of gameplay. There's a lot to unpack here. I'm always really interested in those weird times where a series just spirals into different territory for a while, especially when that series becomes a platformer. I had a blast talking about the Pac-Man World series, and Frogger very much feels like a similar scenario to me, so I've been dying to see how this whole series plays out. Let's start with the PS1 version, simply titled Frogger. Some people like to call this one Frogger He's Back because of the tagline on the front, but as far as I know, that's not an official subtitle. The spine just says Frogger, and all records of the game existing just say Frogger, so as far as I'm concerned, it's just Frogger. This was a 1997 reboot of the series for the original PlayStation, developed by Sony Computer Entertainment Cambridge. They were also known at the time for developing the medieval games. Hasbro handled publishing. It was the first Frogger game in over 10 years when it came out, so it made a pretty big splash as an arcade throwback, so much so that it even became one of the best-selling games on the PS1 and over 4 million copies sold, which also makes it the best-selling Frogger game of all time. Well, I'll be go to hell. This thing did numbers, man. My guess would be the brand recognition, I guess. Like, it was a huge hit in arcades a decade prior, and unlike Pac-Man, there was only ever like 2 Frogger games, so I guess the phrase New Frogger probably held a little bit more weight than the phrase New Pac-Man did. The game's pre-rendered intro paints precisely that image. Hey, remember Frogger? Well, this is new and improved Frogger. It's the same thing from before, but better. Simple as that. Well, at least that's the idea on paper, a paper that apparently sold millions. The first world is a recreation of the classic arcade level, and for the most part, this plays pretty similar to the original. Movement is tile-based, hitting one of the 4 directions on the D-pad will have Frogger hop to the corresponding tile. Though I find this can be a lot more clunky in 3D, especially when hopping to moving objects, because sometimes it'll put you on a tile you didn't want to go on because you kinda landed in the middle, sorta. It'll happen less and less with more and more practice, but getting a grip on it can be a bit irritating. Just like the original arcade game, the goal of any given level is to find and collect all 5 frogs, hopping across an obstacle-filled map and dodging anything that'll kill you. Each time you grab one, you'll be placed back at the start. Collect all 5 and you advance to the next stage. The second world onward ditches that single-screen arcade-like level design in favor of more modernized levels. The goal is exactly the same, you're still collecting 5 frogs, but instead of making it to the end of the same screen over and over, you're now exploring more open-ended maps for them instead. At first, I imagine tile hopping wouldn't be a good fit for navigating a level like this. You can't just hold it, you gotta keep tapping the D-pad again and again to move, but it works surprisingly well. The controls are pretty tight and responsive, and each hop has a distinct sound effect that plays with each input, giving it a very direct and analog feel. It feels really good. Moving across the street and ducking in and out and swerving around moving obstacles with tap 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 that D-pad, it is so satisfying to master. You can also use the X button to super hop. This is a higher jump that'll get you to higher areas. The triangle button will make Frogger lick up any nearby flies with his tongue. Most of these just give you extra points, but some of them give you extra time, extra lives, or even power-ups, like making you hop faster, hop automatically, or extending your tongue's length, all temporarily. The circle button also croaks. I don't even know what this did until I checked the game's manual later. It allows you to call baby frogs. Oh, so it's kind of like a hot or cold. You can use it to hear when you're nearby one. That's kind of neat, I guess, but I never really found it helpful enough to really remember to use it. And yeah, that's all there is to it. It's a super simple game. All you pretty much do is move, dodge obstacles, and find all the frogs. It's almost as simple as the arcade original, but it works quite effectively as an action platformer as well. But this is where the fun stops and where the problems begin. Like, yeah, the controls are good and the premise here is solid, but everything else is like, God, where do I even begin? Okay, let's start with the most fundamental of problems. You have to find all 5 frogs scattered throughout the stage, so of course, a good chunk of the game's focus is on exploration. But exploring is made very difficult by a lot of things. The first thing is the camera. Like, for most levels, it's way too zoomed in. You can barely see anything, and you don't have very much time to react to anything because of it. The amount of times I die because of something I could barely react to was ridiculous. Enemies will fly on screen when you didn't even know they were there, or you'll miss a jump because a thing you had to land on zipped into view way too freaking fast. Some levels can be really confusing too. A lot of them have all of these moving platforms that go all over the place, bringing you to tons of random chunks of the level, and since it all looks pretty samey, and since the camera is super zoomed in, remembering where's where and how to get to what can be needlessly difficult. The camera never zooms out. You never get a wide or proper look at the map. It'd be like trying to find Jiggies and Banjo, except you have to stare at the ground the whole time. Like, you're not gonna find anything because you can't see anything. And to make matters worse, the game is extremely unforgiving. Like the arcade version, you die in one hit, and you only get 3 lives. If you run out, you have to do the entire level all over again. And when you combine that with a bad camera and unfair enemy placement, you get a game where you're going to die non-stop. You will die a lot in this game, many times of which will absolutely not be your fault. And you have a time limit on top of that, so you can't really take your time either. You're expected to get each frog really quickly, so you don't even have enough time to really explore and figure out where they even are to begin with. Riding certain platforms long enough flat out kills you too. A lot of birds will just dump you off at a certain point. Couldn't you at least have a sign that warns about that so I don't have to die to know when to get off? No, they couldn't. So again, the only way to know where you can, can't, and should go is through tons and tons and tons of trial and error. Yeah, it's one of those games. The ones where your only option is to memorize the entire stage and then pray that you get it in a magical, perfect, flawless run. The amount of preparation any level takes to finish is comparable to that of speedrunning. You have to already know where everything is because the camera's too zoomed in to see it, and you don't have enough time to casually or leisurely look for it because there's a time limit that barely gives you enough time to even learn these things to begin with. A lot of times I get to a new level and I have to spend half an hour dying over and over just to learn where the frogs are, and then it becomes a matter of getting lucky enough to get them all without dying too many times, which can be a really hard thing to do. Even if you do already know where they all are, there's still the camera problems, there's still the enemy placement problems. Some of these enemy patterns barely even line up consistently. Like, there's too many times where I had to die because the window I needed to be able to get by just never opened, and I had to either get hit or I had to run at a time trying to backpedal to line it up. And then the game will have the nerve to expect you to make that extremely difficult thing work more than once without dying. One of the worst levels in this game for me was this sewer level, Uncanny Crusher. You have to navigate a slippery oil slick while dodging these moving spikes, but since you can't stop and the controls are really flimsy and inconsistent here, it's nearly impossible to get by this thing. I kid you not, it took me half an hour to get by this thing once, and then I realized I had to get by it twice to get the other frog. Are you joking me? I have to do this twice to get 2 frogs and beat the rest of the level without dying very many times at all. I think that's where challenge stops and brutal, grueling, unneeded difficulty begins. I actually could not beat this level, not until I found out there was an infinite lives code, so screw it. I'm gonna cheat, at least just for the ones I couldn't beat. I turned it off otherwise. I usually don't really like cheating because I feel kinda obligated to beat a game fair and square before I earn any credibility to talk about it, but I really don't mind it here because this game's flat out unfair. And it's actually kind of interesting because the moment that dying no longer meant losing all of my progress and I only had to get each frog once, regardless of how many mistakes I made, the game actually became a lot more enjoyable. When you're no longer stressed out all the time because the game is no longer punishing you so severely for making mistakes, you start to feel inclined to take more risks and learn the level more efficiently. Sometimes being less punishing can be more encouraging, and in the end, it can make the game a lot more fun. But Frogger seems to be much more interested in wasting your time than it is letting you have fun, even the way it makes you go back to the beginning of a level every time you get a frog. Like, yeah, that made sense in the arcade, that made sense in the context of playing something primitive with one looping level as best as you could for a high score, but nobody cares about high scores at home, especially before online leaderboards were a thing, so why are we still prioritizing that sort of design here? Why can't I just get a frog and continue moving on from there? Why do I have to navigate impossibly hard obstacles more than once in a single run? Why does the game even have such a high emphasis on high scores anyway? And why does it start on O every time it makes me enter my initials? All of my high scores say 000 now. Man, and I thought, I was good at Donkey Kong, but you should see play Frogger. Well, I guess I shouldn't make it seem like every level's bad. Some of them were actually pretty fun. There's way more frustrating ones than fun ones, at least in my experience, but there were some in there I did have fun with. And the level variety is quite good too. There's a lot of different settings, from a forest to a cave, a factory, the sewers, and most of them have their own unique stage gimmicks too, like pushing buttons to activate machinery, or explosive barrels that'll launch you across the stage, and maybe limited light you gotta refill by eating fireflies, or hazards that'll move on the Z-axis. But while I do like the variety of levels and the unique challenges they can pose, the greater problems make it much too difficult to enjoy any of the good ideas a level can offer. Well, I guess at least they do have a lot of visual charm. Each world has a distinct color palette, with unique enemies, characters, and moving platforms. The graphics, like the gameplay, are very simple. There's a lot of bright, primary colors, not much detail, and it's quite effective. Frogger looks pudgy and goofy, just like he should, and some of these levels can look really nice. These cloud levels were almost therapeutic to me. The colors are really easy on the eyes, and I love how the background is faded a little bit to create that illusion of it being far away and having the details clouded a little bit by the atmosphere. And the music, it is so nice, man. Like, I could fall asleep to this. My go-to is always Distant Spring from Pikmin, but this actually comes close. It is really, really nice. The music overall is pretty great, actually. The game faithfully updates and remixes that classic Frogger theme while weaving a direction of its own for the greater soundtrack. There's a lot of really catchy drum tracks here. I really like it. They also play this little piano jingle whenever you run out of time. That feels so insulting. That feels like it's mocking you. Like, what's next? You're gonna play a comedic rim shot when I die? Jeez, they really do kill this frog. This thing gets destroyed. He falls to frickin' pieces if you get hit by the mower. That is brutal. One of my favorite things about this game's presentation is easily all of the menus. Like, the level select screen has this stack of cubes that represent each world, and they separate into different slices representing each individual level. It's so cool looking. The options menu is super cool too. It's all of these lily pads floating in the water. There's a lot of movement to it, and they texture the clouds into the water to make it look like there's reflections, which, you know, the execution is primitive, obviously, it's PS1, but it looks solid for its time. Can't say the same for the gameplay, however, because when this thing was out, there was a lot of games that you could better spend your time on. I'm actually blown away at those sales figures now that I know how badly designed it is. I almost feel insulted seeing that green greatest hits label. I highly doubt most people who bought this thing got anywhere in it. You do start with a good chunk of worlds though. You don't actually have to do everything in order to play more levels, so it is possible that a lot of people got to at least see a good chunk of levels right off the bat, but whether or not they beat them, I find that unlikely. Playing this game is like defusing a time bomb. You have to already know what to do, and you have to be really good at it too. But even then, it's still stressful as hell because you know even the slightest of errors will have it blow up in your face at any second. This Frogger reboot's a disaster. It is stressful, grueling, and it is miserable. It is infuriatingly poorly designed, and honest to God, if I weren't reviewing this thing, I never would have had the patience to get anywhere in it. It is one of the most stressful games I've ever played in my life, and it is one of the worst games I've played on this channel. But unlike some of those other bad games I've reviewed, there is actually a really good framework here. The movement's good, the ideas are sound, it was just the execution, and the unwillingness to move on from those arcade elements that were designed to gobble quarters, and not to entertain a home market. I do think the simpler arcade gameplay could work out really well in an action game. Pac-Man turned the simple maze gameplay into a great full-length action game with Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness. Just because a formula is simple doesn't mean you can't elaborate on it and make it something greater than the sum of its parts. And I mean, with such a huge series ahead of us, I have no doubt that at least a couple of these games will do just that. Next up, we have a sequel to the PlayStation version, Frogger 2: Swampy's Revenge. From what I hear, people actually do quite like this one, so who knows, maybe it'll fix all the problems I have with the first one and do something fun. I guess we'll find out next time when we take a look at Frogger 2: Swampy's Revenge. I'll see you guys then.